Is it doing it? Yes. So let's do it. Hello, everyone. My name is Rudolf Gysi. I'm your host today from the Scrum user group Bern. And I work for Organic Change, a small company. We are the sponsor of this event, and we organize that. The other sponsor is on the back of my shirt, Scrum Alliance. So you can note this event and get Scrum user education units if you take part in this event. And we are recording this session. And in terms of rules, it is fun if the speaker sees the audience. So if you put on your camera, you're invited to do so. And on the bottom, you see the function of a chat. So while Cliff will have his talk and you have questions, you may put the questions in the chat. So we want to stop sometimes and we answer the questions. If the talk is over, you ask Cliff whatever you want, and Cliff answers whatever he wants to reveal of his life. So we're not sure whether this takes 1 hour or 2 hours. It depends on you guys, on your question and your interest. So, do I have forgotten something? I don't think so. Cliff, I would like to hand over the session to you. It's your show, and do whatever you want. Enjoy the event. See you later.
Cool. Thanks. Thanks, Rudy. Yeah, so my name is Cliff, and as you can see from my slides, I'm involved with an organization called the Flight Levels Academy. And this is a slightly modified version of a talk that I have done once or twice when we were still allowed to meet in person. And yeah, this is actually my first time presenting completely online, which is an interesting experience. I've mostly been working on the company and not actually doing so much training and conference talks and so on. But the talk itself should hopefully still be interesting. So let's see how it goes. I wanted to start and just see, does anybody know where this is? Can anyone tell me where this is?
Is that infinite loop?
It's actually not.
Kapstadt?
I've actually never seen that.
Cape
Town?
Town.
Yeah, it's
Cape
South
Town.
Africa.
It is Cape Town, South Africa. And I like this picture, partly because it's an awesome picture, but also because this is where I'm from. This is my home. I was lucky enough to grow up here, and I started learning about agile and all kinds of things. I worked in telecoms for a long time, worked at a variety of different companies, but this is where my journey started. If you haven't had the luxury of visiting this wonderful place, I recommend that you give it a try sometime when we're allowed back on airplanes and so on. But yeah, beautiful, beautiful city. So yeah, I was hanging out here doing a bunch of things, and then some people got in contact with me and asked me if I wanted to come and live here in the cold and darkness. Does anybody know where this is?
Stockholm?
Stockholm, yes, Stockholm, Sweden. So I was hanging out in the sun over here, and instead they sold me on perpetual winter, just about, lots of snow and all kinds of things, and said, how about you come hang out and you join Spotify? And I thought, well, this sounds like a really cool opportunity. I don't go outside so much anyway, so probably this will be okay. Yeah, and fast forward, I've now been here 6 years. I spent 4.5 of those years at Spotify. And the last couple of years I started the Flight Levels Academy with Klaus Leopold and Katrin Dietze. Maybe you've heard of them. And also in between that, I've been doing some consulting work, and I've worked with a couple of other companies and so on. So just to give you a little bit of background on me and who I am and so on. But shall we get into the talk? So I'm curious, when you see this picture, I think a lot of people sort of think, about the food and so on. But the reason I like this picture is that for me, it's just a simple picture that represents a story. So the story basically goes that a young kid is watching their parents preparing dinner. And for those of you who have kids, you know what a kid's favorite question is. This is why, right? So they're watching the kid's preparing everything. And the parents cut a little bit of chicken off the one end of the chicken and a little bit of chicken off the front of the other side, and put it into the pan. And of course the kid goes, "Why do you do that?" Parents sort of look at each other and are, "Actually, I don't know. I learned this from my parents." So of course you got to satisfy the kid's curiosity. So a couple of days later, they make a plan and they have a chat with the grandparents. I guess I have to up-to-date the story, and you don't go visit the grandparents anymore, or the parents, but you would FaceTime them or WhatsApp call them or Skype them or something like this, or maybe Zoom. So they jump on and they have a chat, and they say, what's the deal? Why do you cut this piece of the chicken? And the parents, they look at the grandparents, they look at each other and they say, "Actually, I have no idea either. I learned this from my parents." So for the sake of a good story, the great-grandparents are still alive. They managed to get them on a call and they have a chat with them. And the great-grandparents, the grandmother immediately just starts laughing. And when they ask the question, "Why do you cut this piece of the chicken?" Turns out that basically the grandmother says, "Well, what actually happened was that when we got married, we didn't have so much money and we had a very small oven and thus a very, very small pan. And so in order to fit the chicken inside the pan, we had to cut a little bit off the top and the bottom," right? Now, I like this story because I find it a little bit funny, but I think also what happens is very often we do this in our organizations. We see something that Spotify, Facebook, Google, Amazon, whoever else is doing, and we decide to copy and paste it into our organizations. So we copy something that they're doing, but we didn't necessarily do as the kid did and ask why. What was the reason why you did that thing? What was the problem you were solving? Because if we have a really large oven and not such a small oven like the great-grandparents had, maybe we'll be a little bit off the mark, right? So I start with this story just because I like to sort of frame the idea. I think very often what I found is talking to people, especially when I was still working at Spotify, a lot of people try to look at what Spotify is doing and say, "Oh, well, we want to do that." And sort of the idea is that we're going to take it and copy and paste it. And I think the thing that I want you to take away from this story is really to think, why would you do that? And not to say why as in like, we shouldn't do it, but think about, does it actually solve your problem? What problem do you have? What's the situation that you have? And is that something that's actually worth doing at this point in time? So I leave you with this just kind of in the background. So keep that in mind throughout the talk, that I'm not trying to sell you that you should copy and paste exactly as I'm suggesting or describing, but maybe you want to do something and just kind of think about it for yourself. As Klaus always says, when you're doing things with Kanban and flight levels, you have to think. It requires that you still have to think. So the second part of why I like the chicken is because very often when I work with companies, I talk to the senior leadership of the company and they describe their oven to me as this. It's a big, fancy, shiny new oven. It's got all the bells and whistles, and look at the size of that chicken. You can cook for a whole family in there. I guess it depends a bit on the size of your family, but it's a nice, fancy oven. The challenge is that in reality, our oven looks probably a little bit more like this. We're dealing with some old infrastructure. We've got some technical debt. We've got some teams in remote offices that maybe we've not figured out yet how to communicate so well with. We've got a department who doesn't, talk or collaborate. And the reality is that in some cases, when we start to look closer, it's actually even a little bit more like this. There's parts of the organization maybe not working as well as we thought, right? And the challenge with this is that essentially, if we're expecting that we are super powerful and super strong, but in certain areas we're actually not so hot and kind of struggling with a lot of things, we tend to make decisions in a weird way. So to give an example, if I ask you, we want to travel from, say, from Berlin to Stockholm, and if you want to take a train or fly, but in fact, you're actually in London and not in Berlin, you take a very different route, right? Knowing where you are is very, very important part of it. Where do you want to go is one thing, but where are you right now? Because the starting point is actually quite important when you're trying to understand what solutions will work for your current situation. So a little bit of preamble just to kind of frame the stuff that I want to talk about. Hopefully these two metaphors and my pictures are at least mildly amusing and make some sense. But of course, the question that I asked at the beginning is, so how do we move beyond copy paste? If a lot of organizations are doing these things where we look at what others are doing, I want to kind of say that I think it's a good idea to be inspired by what others are doing. But as I say, let's engage and think a little bit, see what actually works for us, and we can figure out from there. So in order to do this, I want to talk about this. So basically I want to look at this problem from 3 different lenses. So the first one, Sapiens, which is about humans, how the people are often overlooked in the challenge of organizational change. Systems, so how the parts fit together and interact. And science, how do we validate what's working so that we do things that only work and shut down the things that don't? Yeah? Cool. So I wonder, do you know how to use the raise hands feature in Zoom? How many of you have heard this saying, people resist change? Have you seen something like this? Yeah, I'm seeing quite a few hands. So there's another variation of this that I've heard. People won't work unless we tell them what to do or we tell them to work. You heard something like this? Yeah. So the challenge for me is that these 2 assumptions tend to kind of rely on the idea that somehow people are inherently lazy or trying to be avoiding doing work. And I think that this is actually a dangerous assumption. And I'm going to explain a little bit of why. So it basically assumes that you have dead wood inside your company. And my opinion on this is that if you have dead wood inside your company, there's really only 2 ways that it got there, right? As the slide says, either you hired live wood, or either you hired dead wood, or you hired live wood and you killed it, right? So the idea behind this is basically, if you think about it in the sense that you can't necessarily apply motivation to people, but what you could do is remove the obstacles that block people from being effective. And this is kind of one of the core premises of my thinking that I think certainly differs from a lot of the organizations that I've worked with in the consulting space. You know, we've got bonuses and targets and all kinds of things as if people would do absolutely nothing unless you applied some sort of carrot or stick. So where does this come from? I think part of the challenge is that as an organization's our mental model of management and strategy tends to be a little bit like this. It's chess, right? We think of it basically in terms of trying to win, take the other pieces, and we also think of it as very sort of cause and effect is somehow correlated and linear. They react to each other. If I do this, you would do that. And another part of it is that we think about things in terms of machine models, right? Everything can be broken down to its parts. We improve the parts and then somehow the machine is better. And the reality is that sometimes our machines are a little bit weird and funky, right? I think that a much better metaphor for thinking about organizations is actually plants and gardening, right? If you think about it in this way, you can't tell your plants to deliver a certain amount of growth by the end of Q2, otherwise they're not going to get their performance bonus of some fertilizer, right? I mean, it's a little bit absurd, but it doesn't work, right? Talking to your plants, I mean, some people will tell you that it maybe helps, but I think it helps the gardener more than the garden. The reality is that if you want to plant and you want to grow things effectively, what you need to be able to do is plant in the right season. You water in the right amount. Give them enough sun, right? Make sure the soil is taken care of. It's very little about the plant itself and much more about the environment. And I think this is such an important factor to think about. To illustrate my point a little bit, I want to ask, does anybody know what's going on in this picture? Any guesses?
Looks like a Senate hearing or something.
Yeah. The guy with his hands sort of forward like this is Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States. And this room, believe it or not, is actually having a discussion about women's rights. And I don't know if you can tell, but it's fairly unlikely that they managed to make any kind of remotely good decision, given that there are no women at all in the room. And this is just one example of how our biases lead to us really not taking into account the diverse perspectives and the variety of different people whose needs we are trying to meet within an organization. If your meeting rooms, your boardrooms, so on look like this, probably you have a little bit of work to do, but this is only one piece of the challenge, right? I wonder if you can tell me what's happening in this picture. Anyone know what's going on here?
Looks like orbit satellite monitoring on the back. So India's first satellite, kind of.
Somebody's looking in the background, yes, right. So most of us, when we see this picture for the first time, probably don't think that this is the Indian crew who launched the first successful satellite. They're basically sitting here celebrating that they've put a satellite into space, right? And that's a pretty momentous achievement. The reality is that most of us look at this picture and we think, yeah, maybe it's a wedding or family reunion, something like this, because we have certain assumptions about women, about scientists, about a whole variety of different things that lead to some sort of bias, right? Now, I'm not going to tell you that bias is a bad thing, although it does have some negative consequences. I want to tell you a little bit of a story about where does bias come from and what we can do about it. So many, many years ago, we would be walking around on the plains, and if one of these things jumped out of the bush and started charging towards us, we needed to be able to have some sort of a reaction to it, because otherwise we would turn into lunch, right? If we, however, sit there and we see, well, you know, it's yellow and it looks sort of shaped like a lion and it's running in my general direction, he seems fairly hungry and he's moving relatively fast. By that point, you've already been eaten, right? So what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to snap quickly, react and respond to certain information as quickly as possible, because very often the cost of delaying that kind of decision and having the wrong choice and not reacting is going to be a problem, right? It's the same thing that makes us run away from the lion, duck when, you know, there's a loud noise or something like that, that causes us to see some of these people and not include certain people in this conversation, right? Very often what we try to do is we basically are approaching sort of our organizational changes and our things essentially like this. You know, we're saying, you weren't listening, I said, don't fall. And the reality is that for most people, you know, we need to actually have a conversation with them and try to lean in and understand what is their circumstance. I mean, even just the simple difference between an extrovert and an introvert, right? Or somebody who likes to be around people and somebody who prefers to have quiet when they work, right? These sort of differences, we need to be able to accommodate these at some level. Otherwise, some people are going to be working suboptimal level. So what we want to try to be able to provide is essentially an environment where people feel safe. Now, there's a lot of different ways that you could talk about this, but in practice, what you want to be able to do is you want folks to be able to feel that they can be fully present and engaged in what they're doing, right? And if they feel that in any way their rights or their freedoms are being infringed upon, they're unlikely to be able to do this, right? So if you're having a meeting with the leader and you feel like the kid on the right and the leader is the person on the left, perhaps you have some work to do, right? You want to shift that power dynamic slightly. If things like making suggestions, right? You feel like that kid again, this can be a challenge. Possibly running your retrospectives, you know, entering the room, you want to raise a flag and say, hey guys, I'm not so happy about this thing. But the reality is that you know that somebody's going to, you know, bite your head off or shout you down. Probably less likely that you're going to raise your concern. Facing a restructure, another example. Yeah. Performance reviews is another great example. So I want to say that I'm not trying to advocate that everything has to be kind of designed for the lowest common denominator. What I'm trying to do is say that we have an environment where we want to be try to be as inclusive as possible, so that we're broadening intentionally our perspectives that we gather, right? I often use an example. If I hold up this phone, if some of you are sitting on my left, my right, and in front of me, you will see different angles of this phone. Some of you will see the side, like this side, some of you will see that side, and some of you will see this side. And together, all of us can see a full broad perspective. And so when we combine our diverse perspectives, we tend to build better solutions, but also have a better understanding of the situation that we're in. Remember the oven that I talked about at the beginning. We want to know what the oven is like and what it looks like, because otherwise we design the wrong solution, or we design as if we're coming from Berlin instead of London. We end up, you know, with an expensive rebooking fee, amongst other things. So one way to think about this is that if you think of diversity as being invited to the party, the second necessary condition of this is inclusion, which means choosing the music in addition. So it's not simply enough that we go from this situation to having more women, more people of color, more older people, more younger people, a mix of different backgrounds and perspectives in the room. We need to fix that diversity, but we also need to intentionally design around the exclusionary bias that happens within the context of that conversation as well, right? So if you've got a different makeup inside your room, but still none of those people are talking, that's the part that I'm talking about. You need to shift those environmental factors that people can be included. I want to give you three simple examples of how you can do this. So one example of how bias can come into this sort of CV or interview process is simply by removing the names. We ran an experiment on this at Spotify. We took the names of the CVs. A couple of companies have done this. And simply by the fact that we couldn't now tell if the people were male or female, it skewed the hiring rate and the first screening interview calls far more towards 50-50 than we'd ever had before. There are several other factors. So literally just knowing that the person is a man or a woman will shift our perceptions ever so slightly. And what I'm trying to get at is, rather than trying to tell people that they're bad because they have these biases or that they make decisions in those certain ways, is to simply acknowledge that they exist and say, let's design our systems around it so that the bias doesn't hurt us so much. So an example of that, removing the names. Another example of that could be to remove, where did you study? Where did you go to school? What languages do you speak? What country are you even from? Now, I realize that during the hiring process, you may need some of this information for other reasons, but certainly when you're doing a screening call, a lot of that is not so relevant. Removing that can help. Another example of this is that very often when we arrive in a meeting, let's say I experienced this quite recently with a restructure. We sit down in the room, a few hundred people are finding out about this restructure for the first time. They're told a whole bunch of different factors about what's changing and why and who's moving where and how this is going to work. They're asked the question of, do you have any questions? Maybe one or two hands go up, you answer a few questions, it's like, okay, cool, thanks for coming, done. And what you're basically getting in that situation is that you're only getting the people who feel very comfortable raising a question in the immediate, and it tends to be more people who are snap thinkers rather than people who like to deliberate, and also those who would likely think through the problem in much more detail. So try to make sure that you give people time to think. You can either follow up, like precede it with some pre-reading, or give people time to think and then follow up with questions down the line. Cool, I'm gonna skip that one. Yeah, and basically what we want to try to do is create safety to be able to try whether we succeed or fail, right? Because I think you all probably know this, having worked in the agile world, if you can't fail, yeah, you run into lots of challenges. Nothing new is ever tried, right? We just don't do anything different. We do exactly what came before, and therefore we know the outcomes that we will get. We cannot get new outcomes if we don't try something that is new and novel, and we have to have the possibility to fail, right? And secondarily, we need to acknowledge and design around our biases. So on the point of Sapiens, if you'd like to do some further reading, here are 3 books that I really enjoy and recommend on this. The first one is Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. She won the World Series of Poker a couple of times. She's really fantastic. The book is a wonderful read about making smarter decisions and overcoming bias. Powerful is the story of the creation of Netflix's the company culture from the perspective of someone who worked in the HR department and led the team that did it. And Humble Inquiry, probably some of you have heard of Edgar Schein. It's a wonderful book that I recommend very often to people who have a very strong sort of directive leadership style as opposed to asking questions. And the idea is, the gentle art of asking instead of telling. That's the subtext of the book. And it really is a quite powerful book. I think in the coaching world, it's quite interesting, but it also frames it in such a way that is, easy to grasp and quite pragmatic. I will be able to make my slides available if you'd like to reference this later, so don't worry if you're not catching it all right now. Cool. So next, we talked about Sapiens. Shall we talk about systems, or system visibility, as I've called it in this slide? Cool. So I just want to make a point quickly. So the reason I put so much effort, and it's probably half of the talk is about the Sapiens side, is for me, what I've often seen is that companies come along with, we've got some grand new idea about a structure, a tool, a process, some sort of change. And all of these things are great, but if you can't get the humans on board with making those changes and actually doing it in reality, it doesn't matter how good your ideas are. And the biggest failing that I see organizations making in the process of adopting some sort of change is that they overlook the people side. And so that's what I'm trying to emphasize on here. I think it's so, so important. Take the people into account. Otherwise, you're just asking for trouble down the line. Cool. So system visibility. Some of you have probably seen a part of this slides because they're plagiarized directly from Klaus Leopold, who's my partner in the Flight Levels Academy. but you would have seen this kind of a situation. So you have some sort of a board within an organization. One team has a backlog, they do some things, maybe they develop a product and it's done. And always what we find is this little bit labeled in red there that's called external waiting. You seen something like this? Yeah. So the question I ask people in this situation is like, okay, cool. So once we're done with that, once we've finished with the external waiting and we've gone back and forth a few times and it actually lands in done, are we actually done then? And usually the answer is, well, you know, actually what happens is we're probably doing something like this. We're waiting for integration. Okay, cool. And then what do you do? Well, no, well, maybe we have to wait for acceptance testing as well. And if you say, okay, cool, well, then are we actually done? No, well, it turns out we also have to wait for the releases, right? So we rushed all the way through the development cycle super, super quickly. We can do that once a week in the Scrum world, or maybe every 2 weeks. But then integration testing takes several weeks. Sometimes it's even monthly or quarterly. And this to me doesn't look so super agile, right? But how about if we go the other way? Say, well, this next column over here, turns out it's actually the development backlog. It's not the entire company's backlog. It's not where all the ideas come from. So, well, what happens before that? Well, turns out we have a product backlog and we do some analysis. We're waiting and a bunch of things are happening along this line, right? You've seen something like this, I think? Yeah. So if we keep going and we say, well, what happens before that? What about before the product backlog? Where does that come from? Well, now it gets even more crazy. You know, we've got a pool of new ideas. There's some steering committees, some OKRs, some prioritization boards and project reviews, sign-offs, rough concepts, all of this kind of stuff, right? The challenge with this is that when you zoom out and you look at it, it's pretty long, right? There's a lot of things happening. And the reality is that these are happening on not such an agile cadence. We're doing something monthly, quarterly, yearly, something like this, right? And in reality, what we're also saying is that this is where we're doing agile. This is where we want to be fast. Now, to me, I kind of wonder, like, what is the point in making all of this so super, like that middle bit, the develop bit, so super fast when the rest of it is taking months and years? We end up in a situation where the company's like, yeah, you know, as Klaus says, we're so fucking agile. What is the point? What is the point in being super, super agile in this tiny little step of the process when all of these other things are happening on other ends of it? So if we look at this in a bit more detail, and some of you have probably seen this visualized in different ways before, right? We're working over there on the black highlighted parts, and we're waiting on the red bits, right? So what we're doing is we're essentially driving at full speed between red traffic lights, yeah? Doesn't really make so much sense to me. You burn more fuel, you really don't get there so much faster. You've probably seen this, I won't go into too much detail, but essentially if you think about your lead time, there's a sum of touch time and the wait time, right? And to me, it doesn't make so much sense to speed up the waiting, right? Or the working, at least, if the waiting is most of the lead time. That is our opportunity, right? I worked with an insurance company. They had a 36-month average lead time on their projects. The amount of time it spent in software development was somewhere between 2 and 12 weeks. That's the development potential, right? The rest of it is mostly sitting, waiting for a project review board or somebody else to do something. Reduce the WIP, focus on creating some improvements, removing the waiting time rather than trying to optimize the working time. Suddenly we start to see once a quarter we can release instead of once every 2 to 3 years. People's minds were completely blown. Like, we aren't working any harder. We're just putting all of the bits together, removing all of the waiting. So what I like to talk about in this is that we want to visualize and manage the end-to-end flow. Now, a lot of the time, what happens in organizations, people say, oh, but we're going to do some sort of agile or Scrum or Kanban or Safe Less, whatever it is. And what we do is we go out and we start to focus on the teams. So we make each of the teams super, super agile. But the reality is that the one team next door to them is also super, super agile. But the reality is they have an 8-week backlog between each of them, right? And so the challenge is that if we want to actually try to optimize across the teams, we don't need to do so much optimization within the teams, although that can have an effect at some point as well. If we want to access this pool of lead time that is just floating around, what we want to do is focus on the interactions between the teams and across the value stream. So the end-to-end flow. Luckily, we have a concept that we've come up with around this, which is called flight levels. I think some of you have probably heard of this before, so I won't go into too much detail, but you can, of course, find lots and lots of information about this on the internet, or go, I put my old website there, unfortunately, but flightlevelsacademy.com is a good place to have a look. So essentially, if you think about it as this, we've got teams doing Scrum or Kanban or whatever they're doing at the team level, and this is good, right? That helps. It definitely makes some improvement in terms of the local area. But what we want to try to do is think about how does this connect to the strategy, right? So at the top level, we have the strategy. What is the company even doing? Why do we exist? We build insulin pens, or we build software that helps people to talk on video, or whatever it is that we do, right? Somewhere between the strategy and the operational, we need to be able to coordinate the different layers, right? So we need to be able to do this end-to-end value stream coordination. So how do we do this? What we do is we say we've got, in this example, 3 teams, and they need to coordinate the work across their teams. So we get those 3 teams together, and we build a board that visualizes the chunks of work one layer up from them. We say, okay, cool. Projects, objectives, initiatives, whatever it is that you call them, let's visualize those there, and let's manage flow at that level. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't help so much if each team is super fast if they're not actually working on moving the most important project across the board, right? I don't think this is a super complicated concept, but there's a lot of interesting things behind this, and having had some experience working with it, you find a lot of interesting nuance in terms of how we do it. And a lot of the effort is really around overcoming the existing models of how we think, the chess and the human side of things that I talked about earlier, but also just understanding that trying to make one team super fast usually means that what we do is we make them very busy, right? I don't know if any of you have ever worked in the fire department. Has anyone worked in the fire department? So the thing that's interesting about the fire department is that if you phoned them up and you said, hey guys, my house is on fire, and they look in the diary and they say, well, next week, Thursday at 2:30, we have an opening. We can come and put out your fire then. How does that sound, right? Probably it's not working so well, right? But we do this inside our companies all the time, right? Everybody is so very busy, they're booked wall to wall that they cannot respond to the most important things in the organization. So what does the fire department do, right? In between, they're basically, I guess, probably training, practicing putting out fires, posing for calendars, some of this kind of stuff. I think that's mostly what the fire department is doing in between putting out fires. But basically they're sitting there, they want to be available. So what they're doing is they're actually sitting in a space where they can drop what they're doing and immediately work on the most important thing, which is putting out fire, right? If we have a project or an initiative within our organization that is so critical that it is worth that much effort or that much money, like replacing a house, right? Having a team sitting idle so that when they're needed, they can just switch across, that probably makes a lot of sense, right? The reality is that probably they're not going to sit doing nothing. They can fix some bugs, they can learn some new skills, they can automate some tests, do something like this, but something that's not super critical. And certainly you don't want to be having a situation where you've got these 8 to 12 week long, or some cases even worse, backlogs in front of every team. So basically what we're talking about here is about the feedback loops, right? We want to be able to connect the individual teams together so they're having conversations, right? We want to be able to understand how the parts are fitting together so that this thing that I'm trying to get out the door actually gets the responsiveness that it needs. So how do we do this? So this is a board that we were using. This is one of the tribes that I worked with at Spotify. It's a very light, simple Kanban board, and there's a lot of things that traditionalists in the Kanban world would get upset about, such as there's no hard WIP limits, for example. But basically the idea here was that we wanted to try to visualize all of the initiatives that were happening across this entire group. When we started out, it was about 20 people. Over 9 months, that grew to about 120 people. Pretty rapid growth, a bunch of new systems coming on board, new people getting onboarded, all kinds of crazy things that are happening during that cycle. What we visualized is basically from the left, ideas, things that we want to keep in mind that we may want to kind of look at in the future. And just below that, we've got a new needs triage, and then we discuss that. And if it is essential that it needs to be done, So this team was actually on the release, the critical chain, if you will, or the release blocking path for the iOS and Android apps. So if they release something and it doesn't actually work or it causes crashes in the iOS app, they need to fix it immediately. So if that happens, we move it into blockers, which is the top vertical lane, or top horizontal lane, I mean. And in some cases, we look at it and we say, no, actually, nope, we're not going to do it. And we drop it into the bottom left. And then, of course, somebody takes responsibility to go back to the team that requested this thing or the person who reported and say, we can't replicate it, or it doesn't affect enough users, or we don't think it's worth doing, or whatever it is. Then if you have a look at the board, there's some, across the vertical, there's the horizontal lines. So we have blockers, product and operations, recruitment, and tribe improvement. Basically, what we're trying to capture here is that there are many different things that would consume people's capacity, and all of that capacity is capacity that would be affecting the delivery of the other things, right? So if I am working on recruitment, I'm not working on software development. If I'm working on a blocker, I'm not working on tribe improvement. And we want to acknowledge that these things all fight for the same capacity. So we just throw them up there and we have a conversation about them. Practically, we do a stand-up every morning. Initially, this worked until we were about 80 people or so, and then it started to become a little bit difficult. And also what we found is that about the same time, some teams started to stabilize and form. So there were sets of systems that the same group were always working on. We said, well, let's just formalize that structure, and the work that relates to that will go to them. And then they'd keep the icons here, or the post-it notes here, but we started doing it on a less frequent basis. Yeah, triage of the things could happen within the team. We don't need to do it at the high level. The last thing I want to point your attention to here is on the top right, the green sticky notes that's labeled current bets. And this is probably one of the most important things for me. So I used to get very worked up about WIP limits. You have to have a WIP limit and you have to create focus and all of this stuff. And what I realized is that very often we ended up having very detailed conversations about what should the number be and how many things and what if that changes and so on. And so what I decided to do rather was let's forget about that concept and say, let's create focus. So what we've done is we've ranked them number 1 to number 6. And the notion is that number 1 should never be blocked by something lower on the list. So number 3 should not be blocking number 1, right? So what that means in practice, if you're working on number 3 and somebody from number 1 asks you to help, you should help within reason. I mean, use your brain still and think about it. If it's going to take you 2 seconds to finish what you're doing or 5 minutes to finish it, maybe finish what you're doing and then switch across. Similarly, if you need help from somebody who's working on number 1 and you're working on number 3, probably you shouldn't interrupt them, right? Don't pull them off. Don't change their focus. We want to make sure that number 1 is actually being treated as number 1, right? So I talk about rather creating focus rather than limiting WIP. The practice is the same because you end up reducing WIP, because what happens is that people don't start so many things because they try to help on the higher up stuff. And that heuristic is far more important, because if you simply focus on a number and the limit, what happens is that things can move at all different paces. They can all move super slowly. But if you create number 1 as the top priority and actually do it first, it tends to move a lot faster. Cool. So if you're interested to learn more about the systems side of this, there's 2 books that I really love and recommend in this space. The first one is Klaus's book called Rethinking Agile. And this is basically the story of the creation of flight levels. It tells a wonderful kind of illustrated example of how this plays out and the 4 common challenges that companies run into in this space, and talks a little bit about the solutions. And the other one is more around general systems. And it's a book written by the wonderful Donella Meadows. It's a very general, it doesn't apply only to Kanban and work systems. And what I love about it is it gives examples all the way from forestry and ecology through to companies, to countries, to macroeconomics, to microeconomics, everything. And it really abstracts it in a way that you can generalize and understand a lot of different systems. So if you're interested in systems, it's a wonderful, great starting place. So to recap, the 2 pieces on the system side, go beyond the team level, right? Don't just make your teams agile. You have to go beyond this, because if you want the company to be agile, you need the interactions between the teams to work, not just the teams themselves working fast. And in order to do that, you need to visualize the end-to-end flow. Yeah? Think about it as a value stream. from the point where a customer asks for something or you have an idea to the point where the customer has the value. That's the cycle you're trying to optimize for. Cool. So, shall we talk for just a little bit about the science side, or use the science machine, as I call it. So this is a topic that I find really quite fascinating for a number of reasons. But essentially, just a couple of funny things to start with, because I like cartoons. So very often what happens in an organization, we introduce some sort of a change, or we start developing something new. And then what we realize is that, can you see that slide okay? It's perhaps a little bit blurry. But it just says, now that we've developed the side effects, let's go for the cure, right? And we see this often, we introduce a new tool or something and it's going to solve all of our problems. But in reality, 6 months down the line, there's problems starting to occur. Maybe it hasn't fixed some of the original issues. We still have the old system still in place as well because we haven't deprecated it yet, these kind of things, right? So these are challenges. We really need to use some data to try to get better at our decision making. And part of the challenge with this is that very often we end up, doing some sort of extrapolation and stuff like this. And I love this example because it's obviously absurd. If you grab one data point and you extrapolate that, yesterday you weren't married, today you're married, and by the end of the week you're going to have 4 dozen husbands. Of course not, right? We make a lot of issues and a lot of errors when we start to get into data. A lot of them affect our biases that we talked about at the beginning. So one of the most common things that I've seen companies doing for their prioritization is essentially this method. Probably you've seen something a little bit like this. I call it the spreadsheet voodoo. You basically pump in a bunch of random numbers about importance, effort, you multiply them by something and some weighting, and then it spits out a number and tells you magically which one is supposed to be the most important. It's probably better than not doing anything, maybe, I guess. But to me, it sounds a little bit like this. I don't know if any of you know the Underpants Gnomes from South Park, but basically there's this missing middle step, right? We plug in the data and then something and then profit, right? And the reality is that too often that spreadsheet is just, it's garbage in, garbage out for a start, but it's also just missing so much of the information that would be meaningful, because we abstract importance to A, B, and C. We make 17 things number one priority, and I don't know, it doesn't get into what actually makes something important. So I mentioned this book earlier on, but I'm referencing it again now. So what I really like in this book is she talks about, well, one of the concepts I really like, she talks about what she calls resulting. Basically this thing where we tend to evaluate the quality of a decision based on the outcome rather than the data that led to the decision, right? So if I play a hand in poker and I win, I must be smart, is the example, right? The reality is that very often you just got lucky, or you lost, maybe you just got unlucky. Without knowing the probability and the statistics and some of the data around this, it's very hard to actually assess that, right? So what it leads to is, I don't know if any of you have seen this, there's an effect, they call it the founder effect. People start a company and they start doing a certain set of things. The company becomes successful. They start to believe that the things that they did were the things that caused the success, and they carry on doing those things into the future, well past their sell-by date and past the point where they should have changed, and they tend to create problems as a result of it. Everybody always wants to use this feature, and so they keep building that feature again and again and again, or something like this. This is a challenge. The other part of this is that the human mind is basically a story processor, not a logic processor. We work with stories. We don't actually work as rationally as we think. And he expands this further in later in the book. Says, what we actually do is our intuition makes the decision first, and then we apply reasoning, or we invent a reason to justify it after the fact. This is the most common way that we make decisions. They call it post hoc rationalization in this sort of technical jargon. But basically, I make a decision and then I come up with a good excuse for why I've done that thing. And what we want to try to do is that we can improve the quality of our intuition if we are priming it with some data, right? No story would be, presentation would be complete without a quote from Donald Reinertsen. Hopefully most of you know of him. I think I referenced the book at the end, but basically this quote for me is fantastic. Essentially what he's talking about here is he's saying that if you want to decentralize decision-making, you don't only need to decentralize the control or the authority to make decisions, but also the information that is necessary to make good decisions, right? It's not enough simply to say to the team, you're free to pick whatever you want, but I'm going to hold all the strategic data that would tell you whether or not that thing even works, lock up the analytics because privacy and security and blah, blah, blah. You need to be able to solve that. Otherwise, you're basically just asking for a problem. So how can you do this stuff better? So I've talked a lot about what the problem is. Essentially, what I think we need to start doing more is to write down as a first step, and if possible, also quantify your hypothesis. So before you do something, just write it down. Say, I'm expecting that doing this thing will achieve some outcome. And this is not so that you can go around with a stick afterwards and beat people who got it wrong or anything like that. And you need to accept that you will be wrong a fair amount of time. But what you can start to do is you can look at it and say, oh, I thought I was going to win that hand. There's a 67% probability. I've won 67% of the time, but I lost the other, appropriate percentage of the time. And therefore it makes sense. My decision-making is sound. But if it turns out that you're losing those hands 100% of the time, probably you need to update something about your decision model, right? So it'll start to point out the flaws in your decision-making, but also expose the opportunities. Because you think something will happen this much, turns out it happens that much. That's actually quite a big opportunity, right? Spotify is a famous example of the Discover Weekly feature that came out. A couple of people were trying to solve their own problem. I want to discover some new music. It's one of the most popular features on the Spotify client now. They never would have thought it would have been as big a success as it was. They tried it out, they saw what effect it had, and then took it further based on the information that they could see. So that's the first part. The second bit is if we want to quantify the information, what we want to try to understand a little bit, hopefully you've heard of this concept of cost of delay. If you're interested to know more, Don Reinertsen, who I mentioned earlier, and I think I'll link his book later on, is probably the go-to person on this. Basically, if you think about it in the sense of like, if we had this feature or this functionality or this service or this product or that person, what would that monthly benefit be right now, right? So if I could sell this thing on the internet and it was, I'm selling 1,000 units and I could then sell 10,000 units, you can calculate it, you can put some data to it. And that gives an extra precision to your assumption analysis down the line. You can see, oh, sales went up by more than we thought or less than we thought, and we can start to understand why. So I don't want to go into too much detail on this, but basically you could ask some questions around this, how many customers does it affect? How often does it occur? How much money is made? How much money is saved? These kind of questions. Sum all of those things together rather than your A's, B's, 1s, and 2s. Put the actual data points down, right? And come up with a number. If you come to $100,000 a week and the other one comes to $10,000 a week, you know which one to do first, right? It's fairly straightforward. Cool. And of course, the feedback loops, as I said. You need to make sure that you have the feedback loops in place, because having a hypothesis that you never review doesn't really make so much sense. And that's the main reason why we need to have the hypothesis down in the first place. Write it down, try something out, and then reflect on it afterwards, right? Now you have the benefit of hindsight, you know what actually happened, and you can understand a bit better. Cool. And I talked about this already, so I'm going to skip over that. Oh, and I have the same book again. Cool. So the two books that I haven't talked about here, Escaping the Build Trap, the last one there. This is Melissa Perry. She runs a company called the Product Institute or the Product Management Institute, teaches product management. She's fantastic. The book is excellent. It overlaps quite nicely with a lot of the thinking in flight levels, but with a focus on product management and strategy, and specifically trying to build systems to validate whether or not what you're doing actually makes sense to continue doing, and how to tell what doesn't work so that you can change course. And the other one, Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind. And this is really fascinating because it starts to get a little bit deeper into some of the stuff around human biases, how we think and learn. But also I like it because I think it helps to understand a little bit about how you can approach storytelling and how you can respond to people rather than just bombarding them with hard data and facts. This can be quite helpful. Cool. So we talked about two key points here quickly. So we want to have quantified hypotheses as a way to address or minimize the effects here, and focus. Don't let number 3 block number 1. We talked about this a little bit before. Cool. So to summarize the whole talk, 3 points, right? Sapiens, systems, and science. Under Sapiens, we want to increase situational awareness with improved diversity and inclusion. Yeah, we can see more of the whole picture if we're factoring in all the diverse perspectives that are available to us. Systems, want to find where to improve. So where can we make improvements through visualizing the end-to-end flow. And using science, we can avoid resulting and create focus with ordered hypotheses. Yeah. And I've got a different picture and a different sign off. That is me, and that is my consulting company. Cool. Thank you. Hopefully that's been interesting. I'd love to hear thoughts, questions, comments. Let's have a chat.
Many thanks, Cliff. Wonderful talk. We don't have too many questions in the chat. So if it is disciplined, just go ahead and ask questions to Cliff. Let's try this one today because,
cool.
Yeah, we started the dialogue. Whoever wants to question.
Jumping the queue. Hey, Cliff, my name is Simon.
Hi,
Can you hear me? Hey.
I can hear you.
Perfect. So now you can see me as well.
Perfect.
Yes, now I can see you too.
Yeah, here. I'm a friendly bugger. So I work for an international reinsurance company, and they're currently remodeling their whole finance process.
Right.
Obviously, there's some regulatory issue, and very often, I mean, they want to be agile and they push a lot in that direction. But then once you get into, hey, come on, we should be moving in smaller increments, and we should not plan like for, oh, someone, Matthias, nice to see you here. Then people say, well, anyway, we have to deliver everything and we have to deliver on time. So we don't really have that flexibility that you basically need. And I like your approach. I like the presentation, and I think it makes sense. But very often people say exactly what you mentioned as an example. Well, that works if you have a cool app, if you have things where you add small features. Once you get into really big things where you do heavy data migrations and that stuff, it kind of breaks down. Am I not seeing something, or how would you approach that?
I want to check if I understand the question. You're saying that the reality is that they're saying, well, we have to deliver everything and we have to deliver it on time.
Yes.
And that's non-negotiable.
Yes, it's an externally communicated thingy that goes to regulators. And if you don't do this as an insurance company, not a good idea.
And how often do you deliver everything on time?
I know it's unrealistic. And I told them I've seen big things being delayed because many of the big players said, hey, we need more time. They agreed and they pushed out the deadline.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's a very poor hand to play, I think, especially from my situation as a Scrum Master.
Yeah.
If that comes from management, okay, people might buy into it. Yeah.
So the way I think about this is that, like, there's a difference between the desire that I have for, you know, the outcome and the reality of what I can do, or sometimes there's a difference at least. And what we want to try to do is build our situational awareness so that we can understand what that difference is. Because if the difference is this small, well, maybe we can make some small changes. If the difference is that big, either we're going to very much disappoint our suppliers, our customers, our executives, whoever it is that is on the receiving end of this, or we're going to create probably some kind of a storm for us down the line. And what I'd like to be able to do is to get it to a space where we can say, if something does occur that's going to knock us off course, we would want to know that so that we can respond to it as quickly as possible, right? Assuming that the consequences of not landing on course is problematic, right? And that's basically what I think is the benefit of using, I mean, something kind of like flight levels, but some sort of visibility within the organization to be able to see are we actually on track? And it's very rare that I've seen organizations that consistently deliver on time using non-agile methods. Usually what happens is that as you get closer to the date, something happens and we have to, I don't know. I mean, I worked in advertising before and yeah, I worked in advertising before and we had a scenario like this. We were building a global Mobi site for one of the large alcohol brands. And we were supposed to launch sort of 8 weeks from now, and got a call like this morning saying, by the way, our marketing department accidentally bought the television advertising already. It's going live on Thursday. Can we launch before then? And we're like, we've got a 10th of the time that we had. Of course, they know it doesn't fit, right? So we said, well, everything that we've worked on up till now is ready. And luckily we'd worked on the most important things first. And so we went live with, it was beta, but it was live. And so you didn't get people, they didn't waste the marketing spend because the URL could actually work and people could land there and see some of the stuff about the product that they wanted to do. So I think in that situation, that's one piece of the thing, is being able to respond to problems as they occur. But the other piece of it is that what I find often is that those organizations, they set the timeline based on some assumptions that are usually based on the idea that we can deliver this thing in X number of months if the world plays out like this. And that's often a very pessimistic scenario. It's also the reality because of how we operate. But if we focused, we could probably do it in half or even a 10th of the time. So the insurance company that I mentioned, typically 32 months, 32 to 36 months round trip time. They managed to get it down to 12 to 14 weeks. So you could request something, 12 to 14 weeks later, it would be live in production in an insurance company. And the optionality that gives the organization to be able to pivot its strategy or tweak direction or respond to a major outage or a strategic opportunity is very, very high. But if you're completely flooded with work and it takes several years to turn, that is problematic. And the other part of it is that the planning process for these is also usually quite expensive. We do a yearly budget planning cycle or something, and if you want to change it, you have to wait till the next one, or it's very expensive to go through that whole loop again. I don't know if any of this is helpful to you at all, but I would say if you're looking to make improvements, it's probably likely that you might have to do something a little bit different.
Yeah, definitely some good hints. I'll try, and it's a journey anyway.
For sure.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks for your time. Thanks for the insights.
Thank you for the question, Simon.
Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Found a question with Floody. I'm not sure TPS would agree to that. Is that something you would like ask Cliff?
Okay. Well, sure. Before I do that one, I would like to raise a little point at a topic just discussed before.
Sure.
To me, I had a kind of a very big surprise in my thinking, working for the federal agencies back to Switzerland for the last 2 years. And the thing was that I always kept thinking like, be the first on the market, be first to hit customers, be the first to learn and all that stuff. And it's fine, it works, but it doesn't work everywhere. There are situations out there where you just doesn't want to be the first on the market, but if you come to the market, it has to be there. It has to be complete. It has to work. There's no like I'm testing something, especially if you change in law. So the law comes into place on 1 week, a special week, like in 2 or 3 years. And at that time, all the system must be there, and there is no like we test it. So I think about this like a metaphor of cooking a meal. So the people down in kitchen, they make sure that they count backwards. So they know in 1 hour we have to serve this meal. We have spaghetti, we have meat, everything. So we make sure we start doing things that at a special time, in a special point in time, we can serve it fresh.
For sure.
So this is kind of thing, I think you need to change your perspective. And once you do that, then you need to count backwards sometimes and look at your end-to-end flow just in a different way of thinking. And then basically it started making sense.
Yeah.
That was my 2 cents on that one before. But
yeah,
the other one, TPS. What I mean by TPS is Toyota Production System.
sure.
Right? The mother of all that lean stuff. And I just raised a little comment just when you were talking about prioritization, like have a look at the cost of delay and hit the one which would make the cost higher. I'm not sure. If you ask a Japanese guy, I don't know what would they say, but I expect they would say something like the first principle of TPS, saying that you have to have the long run perspective in mind, not a short money. So this one I would a little bit let's say disagree on that one.
So there's some nuance to that. When I say the cost of delay, what I actually mean is the customer lifecycle cost of delay. So over the duration that you have that person as a customer, I shorthand it because otherwise I have to get into a lot of technical jargon and explanations of things. But basically, $10 today versus 100 times, I would still take the 100. If that makes sense.
Thank you.
It depends also because if if you think about the current situation, a lot of companies are sitting cash strapped right now, and so any kind of cash injection could mean that the company gets to live until next week, and thus therefore could also service customers in the future. But if they don't, that becomes a challenge. And so I think it's a case of mapping it to kind of the company's context and the current situation and saying, given what we need, which of these make more sense, rather than just doing it based on politics and opinions that are usually unvalidated.
Absolutely.
And the other piece, just on the point of cost of delay, that often is helpful is that if I explain to you that I think that this feature, just to give you a generic example, that this feature here will bring in 1 million customers, and that each customer is going to pay us $10, for example, $10 every month. That leads you to a couple of assumptions. Firstly, the scale of the system, the usage volumes, for example, but also that we need the billing side of it, and that there's other factors connected to this. And so what it starts to help with, when you can communicate your assumptions about a project in advance and say, here's what we're expecting, it does 2 things. It makes it clear to everybody else why you actually think it's important, but it means that if I want to counter your argument, I could say, well, look, I don't think it's going to be 1 million customers. I think it's going to be 800,000. Okay, that's nice, but it's still number 1. So we don't have to try to like, oh, it's number 1 or number 2 or number 3. We put the data in and then we start to see what's happening. I mean, you're still essentially guessing because you don't know yet. But I think doing something like this certainly will help to have a better conversation around this data.
Thank you for that point, which leading me to the last point afterwards. I sit back again.
That's number 3, Vladi, just to make it clear.
Yeah. That's number 3. That's the last one. Cliff, I think, I interpret, I assume these flight levels don't have that much with scaling. And I understand why. It's a nice side effect that you can scale using flight levels. But for me, the first and primary reason to have flight levels is a different way of thinking at each of those flight levels. So I just know that also the startups think at strategic level in a long-term way. They think at tactical level, and they think also in day-to-day level. And putting these flight levels into at place somewhere kind of promotes this kind of thinking in different time horizons. Is this a way of thinking you would support, or am I kind of misinterpreting the whole notion of your flight levels?
I'm not sure if I fully understood the question, but so are you asking basically, does it map to kind of different levels or time horizons of strategic planning? Does that?
Yes, my question is one of the purpose to having flight levels promotion of strategic kind of thinking in opposed to day-to-day operating stress?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. I'm fine with that. Thank you.
Cool.
Okay, long question, short answer. Very nice. Okay, we still have 26 people in the event, so go ahead with question as long as Cliff has time. We may go ahead.
I'm happy to stick around.
Hey, this is Daniel from Germany. I'll just start
Hi, Daniel.
the video. I wanted to spare you all the Corona mane that I've grown over the last couple of weeks. Barbershops don't have open yet. Thanks for your presentation. It was great. It was really awesome. It's right up my alley. And the fun thing is I'm working as an agile educator, coach, no matter how you want to put it. So, and I really loved the way that you were talking about bets, about hypotheses, about guesses. And in my experience working with some larger companies in the past, this is the main problem. They're thinking in requirements where all those decisions have something to do with power. Like if I'm thinking about a requirement, if I require something of you, you're automatically in a corner. Like, okay, I'm going to have to deliver.
Yeah.
If I'm thinking in guesses and hypotheses, then you're opening up a discussion. So my question would be, do you have any idea on how I could steer a discussion more towards, or how could bring people more to think in hypotheses and guesses?
Two thoughts on this. So, I mean, the framing of bets is explicitly about that. And I mean, Spotify called the company's top priorities are called bets for that explicit reason. And I think that's actually, I'm not sure if it's always possible to start there, but if you have the possibility to shift the language, naming the thing, like that metaphor is powerful. It's a bet, not a promise or a guarantee or a commitment or something like that. You probably still need to talk about these things. Yeah, so if you can shift the language and the metaphors that you use, I think that's helpful. Yeah, there was something else I was going to say on that, which is like, I guess one of the things that I found helpful is to start going first. If you want people to trust your ideas, there's this idea that if you want someone to trust you, go first. And if you put your information out there and say, look, I think this thing can work, and my estimation of the probability is 40% or 60% or 80% or whatever, people can come in and you invite them to kind of bring their data to it and say, yeah, you know, I see the thing you're describing. I don't think it's as likely. I would put it at 70%. Okay, cool. Like, so we've got a range now. We've got 70 to 80%. And we start to talk about that, and you can start to shift the language that way. I think very often people don't have the probabilities. They're actually there, but they just don't talk about them. And what you do is you talk about complexity or uncertainty or other different bywords that mean something, but they're quite vague. And just putting forward, like, this is my assumption. The other last thing I would say is also, if you can get anybody, and the more senior they can be, the better, to talk about their learnings on a journey towards some success, probably first, but also towards failures. So here are some things that we did that worked. We originally thought it was going to be like this, and then it turned out it was like that. And then we discovered this, and just like modeling that sort of thing that you're not expected. Because I think there's especially in the male-dominated leadership world, there's a very strong expectation the leader has to always be right.
Yes.
And that's actually your job. And I think that's hugely problematic. Like, if you're always wrong, you're probably also not going to be out of a job. But you know, it needs to be some sort of balance. If you can't be right, or if you can't be wrong, you know, that's fascism.
Yeah, you're right. You're totally right. And I especially found that it had something to do with the time you're given for having an answer. Like, I mean, Einstein said, if I would have 1 hour to save the world, I would think about 55 minutes about the problem and then 5 minutes on the solution. And I found that especially in corporate world, it just goes the other way around. You're not even finishing your sentences. It's like, oh, I know what to do. So we have to do 1, 2, 3. So, and this is how whole careers are based upon, like being quick in answering.
Yeah. There's a fantastic book. It's sort of adjacent to the topic that you asked about. The book is called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. And they unpack what makes good strategy and what makes bad strategy. And one of the parts of it is exactly that thing, is that you need to capture some of the problem space and the current circumstance. And they talk a lot about this thing of situational awareness. Why is the thing that we're doing uniquely something that we can do that will make us win in the market? Like, how does that actually play out? And rather what we end up doing in strategy is stating, I want this and this and this and this and this, rather than why. And most organizations are actually not using a strategy at all. They call it a strategy, but it's not. It's just a wish list.
Yeah, it's just a
exactly
wish list, yeah.
And I think the challenge is that most people haven't actually seen better, rather than they're, they've seen better and they're just ignorant, like willfully ignorant. They just don't know any different. And so if you use some of the language from that book, it can help to sort of open it up and say, could you sort of give us some of the reasoning behind why you're picking this thing so that we can understand it better? And I think that could be helpful as well.
I will get that one. Thanks. Now,
cool.
Keep in touch. I just followed you on Twitter and we'll send our contact and link if you don't mind. So thank you very much. It was great.
Absolutely. I'm very happy.
We also have a backstage area, but you have to pay for this. No, okay, we still have 21 people in the event. Do you have questions?
Simon is asking a question.
Okay.
Simon, I don't know how to pronounce your surname. Meseli? Are you on the call?
He has written that privately to you. I don't have it in the public chat, I guess. Can you read that out? Or Simon, switch on and ask your question.
The question is, what is my opinion about tools? I hope you're happy to have that discussion more broadly. Maybe you want to just either, type to me or jump on the video and just explain sort of more what is the question about tools?
He just can't get online with probably with the stuff around him. So we'll move to the next question. Or you have understood the question, maybe, or interpretation.
Okay, so you're saying like Jira, Confluence, etc. So, it's always kind of a tricky question to answer, because I think what happens is that people get very excited about their personal preference of tool. And I think that that's fine at some level. The challenge that I find is that very often when companies are adopting a tool or starting to use a tool, there's two things that they tend to do. One is that they pick the tool before they've understood the problem, in a little bit of a vein to the previous question. What are we actually trying to achieve? So, like I mentioned, using a hypothesis, what's the goal? We're going to use Jira, and then we're going to get all these magic reports and all kinds of things. We'll just know what's happening. Like, okay, well, what would have to be true for that to happen? And a little bit like Vladimir was saying, I think it was Vladimir was saying, you sort of work backwards from the original, like the end goal, to where you need to be. And if you work your way through that, you realize that probably 25,000 things are going to have to be true, including miraculously everybody logging everything in the tool, and that it's perfectly up to date, and that you understand how the other teams' boards work, and that they link all the tickets together, and that the system is always up, and so on, so on, so on. And that's not to say that you shouldn't use a tool. What I mean is that they overestimate the value of the thing and underestimate the cost of implementing it. And so if you start with the problem first and say, well, what are we actually trying to solve? And you work your way towards that, that can be a lot better. The second thing is that very often what I found is that the challenge with a lot of tools, and I mentioned Jira specifically because I've had personal experience with this, but this is true for a lot of the tools, is that they become very complicated to manage later down the line. And the harder it is to use something, and this is not necessarily a problem of the tool, it's more that you get somebody who's very excited about being the administrator, and so they put in all these workflows, and then there's permissions and all of this kind of stuff. And me as an individual in a team or on a certain group, I don't have any ability to change something without logging a ticket and asking somebody else for permissions and waiting 6 weeks, and that just slows down the organization's ability to adapt. Whereas if you start with, say, a whiteboard or a digital tool like Miro, for example, you can just move the cards around on the board and you don't have to ask somebody's permission. You don't have to get access to special workflows and so on. I think we often overcomplicate what the tools can do. And the way I like to think about this is that there are scenarios. So like if you're building cars, an electronic ticket tracking system probably makes some sense because you're visualizing stuff that can be integrated and automated into everything. But when you're building product features with departments that don't, live for that long and teams that only exist for a year or two at a time, spending 2 years to roll out a system to automate everything, to me, doesn't make a lot of sense. So it's a little bit about like, where are you in the product cycle? What kind of things are you doing? And are you actually going to get enough benefit from it? And very often what you find is that using just something very lightweight will actually get you most of the benefits that you need without all of the complexity of trying to manage a large centralized system. But that said, if you need to use a tool, there's lots of different things that do work, especially in the current context. Physical whiteboard's not really practical right now. What I usually used to tell people is, start with something that you draw on, like a whiteboard, or what I would mention now is Miro as an example. But draw the thing, and once you know what the board needs to look like and you're using it consistently in a certain way, then consider if it makes sense to build it into some other kind of more workflow-oriented or processy kind of tool. At the end of the day, you have to focus on the interactions more than it is about, like, it's very rare that I've seen any manager or senior leader able to drop into another team's board or another group's board and go, I know what's going on, because you miss the context. It's not for you. And so you have to show up at the stand-ups, in which case the value of all of that stuff is somehow limited anyway. So yeah, I tend to shy away from tools as a start, but there are certainly places where they can be helpful. Don't pick the tool before you know the problem.
Yeah, I like the sentence that you have to show up on team events to get the context. That's also with the lean, Gemba, go and see. I like that a lot. So as a moderation guy, we have closing in 1 hour and 30 minutes. I would like to close the session officially. And thank you a lot, Cliff. It was a pleasure having you here in Bern and for the talk. We will make this talk available on a YouTube channel. I will post that on Scrum User Group Bern. And Cliff also shares his PowerPoint with us, or keynote. Will be all available soon on Meetup. So you can stay in the chat and ask him. If he's gone, he's gone. He's free now. And I stopped the recording. Have a nice evening and see you next time.